Hello and welcome to this panel conversation about the JCPOA and where that is going to take the region and the world. My name is William Law. I'm the editor of Digest. I'm very pleased to be here. This event is co-hosted by Gulf State Analytics in Washington and by the Center for Diplomatic Affairs and Political Studies in Istanbul, otherwise known as DİPAM. I will introduce our panel in just a few minutes. I wanted to say, however, that one of the panelists who can't be here sadly is Dr. Syed Qasim Sajidpour. He's very unfortunately had a heart attack. We wish him the very best from Gulf State Analytics, from DİPAM, from myself, and of course from the panel. And I thank Dr. Hassan AHMADIAN for stepping in at very short notice. And we wish Professor Sajidpour the very best for a quick recovery. I just wanted to very briefly do a timeline about the JCPOA. The JCPOA, of course, was an agreement between the P5 plus Germany plus the EU. The P5, of course, is the UN Security Council, and that is US, China, Russia, France, and Britain. The resolution 2231 was adopted on July 20th, 2015. It was voted on, rather. Then it was adopted in October, implemented on the 16th of January in 2016. And 8th of May, famously, Donald Trump withdrew the United States from that agreement. And I thought it was apropos of that withdrawal. President Trump's then National Security Advisor, John Bolton, famously said, "The objective has been from the beginning to get oil from Iran down to zero. It is our intention to squeeze them very hard. As the British say, squeeze them until the pips squeak." Now, that's the maximum pressure tactic. It hasn't worked. And I was fortunate to be at a RUSI conference here just a few days ago when Professor Sajidpour was one of the speakers. And he said this: Iran has managed the sanctions. There's great self-confidence in Iran. We managed Trump. We survived Trump. Let me begin now by introducing, as I said, our very distinguished panel. Dr. Nurşin GÜNEY is a political scientist, a professor, a member of the advisory board of DİPAM. She completed her master's and doctorate in international relations from Istanbul University Institute of Social Sciences, worked as a research assistant at Marmara University Faculty of Economics and Administrative Sciences, Department of International Relations, as a lecturer, as an assistant professor, an associate professor, and professor. She served as vice president of Marmara University of International Relations Center, then as a dean in the Faculty of Political Science at Bahçeşehir. Let me try that again. Bahçeşehir, Cyprus University. She is now at Nişantaşı University. Dr. GÜNEY is a member of the Presidential Board of Foreign Affairs and Security, and in that capacity serves as an advisor to President Erdogan. Her studies focus on the Middle East, foreign policy of the US, security, NATO, and the EU. Then Dr. Assal graduated with a PhD in Middle Eastern history from the University of California, Irvine in 2018. Her PhD research focused on modern Iran, with emphasis on national identity formation and popular culture in post-revolutionary Iran. Assal joined the National Iranian American Council in January of 2019. As a senior research fellow, she works on research and writing related to Iran policy issues and US-Iran relations. She's written for Newsweek, National Interest, Foreign Policy, and Responsible Statecraft. And she's appeared as a commentator on the BBC, Al Jazeera, and NPR. Dr. Hassan AHMADIAN is an assistant professor of Middle East and North Africa Studies at the University of Tehran and an associate of the Project on Shiism and Global Affairs at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. He's also a Middle East Security and Politics Fellow at the Center for Strategic Research, Tehran. Dr. AHMADIAN received his PhD in area studies from the University of Tehran and undertook a postdoctoral research fellowship at the Iran Project, Harvard Kennedy School, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He's fluent in Arabic, Persian, and English. His research and teaching is mainly focused on Iran's foreign policy and international relations, political change, civil-military relations, and Islamist movements in the Middle East. So I thank you all, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. This is really the hot button topic. The JCPOA, Joe Biden, President Biden coming in signaling he wants to bring America back in. There is a lot of concern in the region, certainly within the Gulf states, in Israel as well, about what that means. And I think in Europe, hope that somehow the JCPOA can be kept alive. It'd be very interesting then to explore this with my distinguished panel. I'm going to begin, if I may, with Dr. GÜNEY. And this is the question. I'll ask you all then to respond to each question in turn. So, Dr. GÜNEY, what are the sources of tension between the US and Iran? And do you believe that they are more ideologically related or more related to power politics? You need to turn your microphone on.
Sorry. Okay, thank you very much. It is a It is a very interesting question. What we are seeing and what is ahead of us is an agreement that was signed in 2015, JCPOA or Iranian nuclear agreement. This agreement was heavily debated since it was, inked in the aftermath up till now. Of course, it depends on what you expect, but from the perspective of non-proliferation, according to my viewpoint, it was a good start. The expectation of Obama administration by them was different, but by re-engaging with Iran, they were expecting that, Iran would become part of the international, system and, moderate its various actions that was considered by its neighbors in the Gulf as well as Western part of the world as being assertive. And so this was thought to be in regard to Iranian military doctrine, which was, based right after, 8 years of Iran-Iraq war, the lessons that they have derived. So that was the asymmetric warfare in terms of making defensive, to have their survival guaranteed in that region. We know that Iran has shortages in its military assets, in terms of conventional weaponry or so. For instance, air defense, the shortages that it had. So it had also developed this civilian nuclear capability within the passage of time in the past. But we know that, they had in breach some of the liabilities of theirs under the NPT treaty. Anyway, everybody knows the story, the long story. But here we are. Right after Trump administration withdrawal in 2018, naturally, Iranians waited for about a year or so to see how the international community will react, especially the Europeans could save the treaty or not, but they couldn't. And hence, Iranians had found themselves that they start, not abiding gradually with the requirements of the agreement, but practically we know that they have done it within the measurements so that in case of, getting together on the table, returning to the treaty, they might swap back and, try to compliance with the treaty. But here we are with the Biden administration. There is the hope during the election time, despite to the Trump's accusations that the treaty was a bad treaty, maximum pressure would bring, the sanctions, Iranians to their knees so that they would come to the table, to the negotiations. But I mean, this maximum pressure policy has not worked. And what we have at hand is a fragile situation. Until June, there is the elections coming up in Iran. So there is a window of opportunity has, opened for a brief time. I hope the two sides, whether waiting one another to say who's going to first, and Iranian says it is the Americans that withdraw unilaterally from the treaty, so they should lift automatically the sanctions, and after that Iranians will come to compliance with the treaty. There are of course medium ways of dealing with the issue. We are hearing from the Europeans that what could be done. So it's up to the two sides to find a way to bring this agreement alive again, because it's very important. It's not only related with Iran versus America, it's about the region and even beyond. So, I mean, it also might have negative repercussions for Turkey, where we are located geographically. And we would like to have our neighbor, Iran, not going nuclear, and we'll have continue our relations, steady relations with them. And so, I mean, there is a brief moment ahead of us, a window of opportunity that this should be, not lost. And for the topic of our, conversation, I guess it's up to Gulf states that they should, other than worrying about it and taking offensive or defensive measures or rhetorics, they should give a hand to bring up some kind of forum to mediate between the two sides. I mean, those who are close to Iran as well as Washington. And in that case, I am hearing that Qatar is on the track, which is a good sign, I guess. And I'm so sure Oman would be also on the track. So I'm hoping that with the facilitating of their mediation, the two sides will come to some kind of a point to bring this agreement alive. But there are, of course, impediments. I don't get into it right now because of time shortage. Not too long, not too short talking. Okay.
Let me bring in at this point, Dr. AHMADIAN. From the Iranian perspective, clearly ideology played hugely in America withdrawing. Is that still an issue now? Can the tensions be diffused through a different approach, perhaps a less ideological approach, or is ideology still very much at play?
Hello, thank you for having me on this rather interesting panel. I think one of the main issues in US-Iran relations in general, or one of the main topics, is ideology. And it goes both ways. I mean, the Iranians have looked at the United States to some extent through the lens of ideology. And the United States, for its part as well, looked at Iran ideologically in one way or another. Take, for instance, President Obama's speech after the signature of the JCPOA. He didn't say that Iran is a country that we can engage. He said it's a rogue state. We're taking out of its hand an element of power to make it less dangerous, i.e. there's an atmosphere that infuses this ideological image about Iran in the United States. So I think it goes both ways, and it's still playing a role. But the pragmatism that took us to the JCPOA brought this hope that this barrier would be, crossed for once and for all. But the ensuing administration, the Trump administration, and then its policy vis-a-vis Iran, I think, really changed the atmosphere here. And it's not only about the officials. You hear that the Iranian supreme leader, you hear the Iranian president saying such and such. But when you go back 10 days ago, a poll published by the University of Maryland on the Iranians, how they view the JCPOA and a return to it, you would see that the Iranians, majority of Iranians, 60% almost, believe that the United States will not commit in an effective way to sanction relief. So this is a real thing in the Iranian mindset nowadays. It's not only about the officials, it's a general thing. And I think the policy moving forward will be hugely overshadowed by what the Trump administration did with regards to the JCPOA. And his regional policy as well, assassinating General Soleimani, all of these will play a role. And I think so far, the Biden administration did not really do good to say that we are different. I mean, there's a different policy. The policy is to this day the same. Maximum pressure is at play, and there is no change in policy. And they were very quick in getting themselves in a position to say, well, you have to move first, and the Iranians saying also, you have to move first, which is, I think, it goes deeper than only who takes the first step. It has to do with what is the place that we are willing to move based on. Is it the maximum pressure, or is it the JCPOA 2015? So the Iranians would focus on JCPOA 2015, saying that whatever was imposed on Iran afterwards is illegal based on international law, and we have to get back to that point. Whereas the United States, the Biden administration, wants to have that leverage. There's a leverage that the Trump administration has paid for it internationally and internally to some extent, and they have it now. So they want to use it. Now, what the Iranians are doing, they are also increasing their leverage to face off that leverage, i.e. they are trying to balance the maximum pressure leverage, which I think the Iranian parliament bill and other issues, I think the regional developments, all of that plays into this issue. And I think we will soon move to a situation that both parties will find it hard to focus on the leverage more. They will have to take a step. We've been there. In 2015, both parties, in 2013, both parties understood that there is no way better than engagement. And preconditioning that engagement with, regional issues, Iran's ballistic missiles, and I think these are issues, they only complicate the thing, the engagement. And I think they will, specifically I'm talking about the United States, because the Iranians, a general idea of what the Iranian think would bring me to this idea that the Iranians will focus on the policy that they are focusing on now. So it's on the United States to change or to continue the same policy. So I would second Professor Sajjadpour, that the Iranians feel emboldened. They have overcame the pressure, the maximum pressure. So they will continue this consensus-built sort of policy for months or even years to come.
Thank you for that. And let's go to Dr. Rad. That perspective, that idea that Trump still casts a long shadow, and that there are still these ideological barriers, and that perhaps President Biden has not done enough to remove those kinds of barriers. What do you think about that?
Well, when we're talking about, I think Dr. GÜNEY and Dr. AHMADIAN brought up very important points. But one of the things that's missing so far in the conversation is the historical watershed moments that have created this ideology, right? This ideology didn't come from the JCPOA, it predates it. We can talk more about this longer history, but the sort of watershed moments that are always selected on the Iranian side, it's the coup of 1953. On the American side, it's the embassy seizure of 1979. And so these are moments historically that define in certain ways the relationships, because there are mutual grievances and sort of mutual humiliations that have occurred historically. And that's what informs the ideology. The ideological standpoint comes from, this happened and so now we are enemies, or this happened and so now we are enemies. But realistically, both sides actually act pragmatically, right? Like Iran and the United States are not unique, either of them. They're both nation states that are acting in their own national interest, as every nation state is doing. And so on the US side especially, there's a tendency to look at Iran as a sort of fanatic ideological state, when in fact, Iran is, acting pragmatically. Iran came to the negotiating table. The idea that, and the Iranian government does this to themselves, right? They shoot themselves in the foot when they endorse sort of this public manifestation of anti-Americanism. But in reality, that's more of a rhetorical stance, because if it was in fact something, and this is an argument that's made in the United States, if it was something that prevented Iran from actually negotiating with the United States, well, we wouldn't have the JCPOA in the first place. So we have concrete evidence that Iran would come to the negotiating table and in fact abide by a negotiation that it had with the United States. By withdrawing from the deal in 2018, what the Trump administration did is sort of play into the hands of Iranian hardliners who would make the argument, again, an ideological argument that, look, the United States can't be trusted, right? And so, looking at it as just what can President Biden do about it, this is a much longer ideological rhetoric that is being used, and it is used on the US side as well. I would say, at least in a public manifestation, the Iranian government is more guilty of this particular sort of ideological rhetoric, but it certainly exists on the US side. And that's part of why we're so stuck in the US, right? It's because of that ideological, that adversarial historical relationship that, for instance, the Biden administration came in and reversed so many policies of the Trump administration on day one, right? On day one, it was returning to the WHO. On day one, it was returning to the Paris Climate Accord. On day one, it was repealing the Muslim ban. All of these things happened on day one. So theoretically, an international agreement like the JCPOA that was actually negotiated by the administration that Biden served as vice president should have been an easy lift. Why isn't it? Because there is still that ideological pushback as well. I think that we need to be focused, though, on the pragmatic, because we're sitting here in this sort of discussion where we're talking about Iran and the United States, but this agreement was not between Iran and the United States. They were two parties to an agreement. This is an international agreement. And in these discussions, I think sometimes what gets lost when we talk as if we're only talking about specific nation states is the entire concept of internationalism and why we created internationalism, why we decided that we need these types of agreements. In this particular case, what is being addressed is not a history of adversarial relationships. What's being addressed is nuclear proliferation, because that is an existential threat to the entire world. There's no border that would not be affected by nuclear proliferation. And when you, again, talking in the sort of ideological sense, Iran has brought up the idea of the Middle East being a nuclear-free zone. And most parties in the region would also agree to that. But there are specific parties who do not, one of which is Israel. And the reason why Israel doesn't agree to it is because Israel has nuclear weapons, right? So when these discussions come up, there are parties that are trying to practically address what will make the entire region and the entire globe safer. But we have to be able to have these discussions less in ideological terms and more in the pragmatic, more within a pragmatic frame, because that's the only way we'll address a threat that is really to the entire species, which is what this particular agreement was supposed to address.
Yeah, you've all raised very, very interesting points. One of the things that strikes me is all of this ideological baggage is a barrier to rebuilding or finding trust, which the trust was fragile at best in any event before President Trump simply pulled out. But let me go back to you, Dr. GÜNEY, and if you can just address that issue of the trust deficit, because I think that is so much a part of where we are right now. You have to turn on your mic. Yep.
Yeah, I did. Okay, thank you. I mean, trust deficit is very important. I mean, it took so many years, especially the negotiation with Tehran regime to bring up this 2015 Iranian nuclear deal. So there were the EU3 involved in it, and others has put a lot of, effort in it. And finally, we had the deal. And so, I mean, it can, of course, be discussed and can debate whether it's good enough or not, whether it could be improved. It is something to be deal with aftermath, after we had a deal again, after we had the deal on the table between the two sides. But I don't seem that we are there yet due to the first of all, as far as I see from here, the situation in US is quite complex as well. I mean, there is the new government, and Biden administration has its own agenda in domestic way. So there is the COVID-19 environment that, the president has to deal with it, vaccination, you name it. And also the country seems to be divided after the elections. And there are lots of issues ahead of the president. So, but as Assal has said, Biden himself was part of this deal because during the Obama administration, he was the vice president. So, I mean, we could have expect that, returning of US to the agreement would be much quicker. But as it's been said, due to the ideological baggage and others, there are the partners and allies of US are there to demand what they expect from returning back to the Iranian deal, the ballistic missiles, what would happen to it, and also Iranian, influence via in certain parts of the Middle East, all these kind of things comes into the table, and the demands of US friends puts more onto the previous agreement. What is best is to somehow to go back what it was in 2015, and then try to bring up the new menu for the follow-up sessions perhaps. But as you said, this trust deficit is quite important because, I mean, we're talking about international law, and as Assal again said, so this is not an agreement between just US and Tehran, and so there is the P5, and so there is the UN involved in it, and so I mean, there is a liability ahead of US to meet the responsibilities and promises that is given. This is not related to Tehran or someone else. Otherwise, how can you trust the agreements? Whether you'll get another one, and you wouldn't know after 2024. There's going to be elections in the U.S. and how would the Iran or others will try to make believe that they can trust US and the agreements they put on the table. So this trust deficit problem is an important thing. And also, I'm also against these sanctions as well. With the sanctions issues, I guess US needs to revisit and make an evaluation about this maximum pressure and how this has, distorted the trust between the two sides. Because it was the Iranians, according to the EIA, they were abiding at the beginning with their responsibilities under the agreement. So despite to this matter of fact that we all know the international community, it was the Trump himself that declaring the, all of a sudden, the agreement as a bad one, just withdraw it without any, hesitation or, so, there needs to be confidence building measures, at least coming from the US side to, or maybe it is the Europeans, somebody around this five has to find a way to build trust. This is not only related with the JCPOA, it's also related with engaging in Iran with the rest of the world. So it's an important beginning, I guess. Thank you.
Let me turn to you, Dr. Ahmadian. This question of trust, of course, it was the Americans who pulled out. There are certainly people in Iran, as there are in America, who don't want the JCPOA. What is the opposition to it in Iran?
Well, when the JCPOA was signed, it was built on a sort of a consensus on the highest levels, because it came out of the Iranian Supreme National Security Council, which basically is the consensus building body and mechanism that basically deals with strategic on the macro level strategic issues. So I think in that time frame, there was an agreement to go for this JCPOA. Now, with the US, the Trump administration's approach, there is no consensus as to how to move forward. So when you take that into account, and those who know the Iranian decision-making process, they know that it's consensus building, basically. It's built on consensus, sort of consensus within the Supreme National Security Council. Now that Iran lacks that consensus on the way forward, it only can focus on what it agreed previously on, which is basically the previous agreement, the JCPOA. That was the way that was agreed upon. That's part of the equation that pushes against any sort of new engagement, basically. That's why the Iranians are sticking to, partly at least, sticking to return to the same agreement. No more, no less. That same agreement was a framework that we need to get back to. And I think, of course, trust has a lot to do with this issue as well. Now, it takes years, decades to build trust, but it takes only an administration like Trump to ruin it in only a day with withdrawing. And there is no withdrawal clause in the JCPOA. It violated basically the JCPOA. So that trust all of a sudden came down. And when there is no trust, you focus on building leverage because you don't trust the other. He will push against you, and you need to have that leverage to push against him. So there is no trust. And that's why you see that the United States is focusing on its leverage, the maximum pressure. Iranians are building up their leverage to balance that up. And I think that buildup of leverage has its limits because at the end of the day, strategic calculus will overweigh the trust issue, because international agreements are not built basically on trust. Because you don't trust the other party, you go for a tit for tat sort of dealing, and then get to an agreement that should be verified, should be overseen, and etc. So that lack of trust is not that strong of a barrier, provided that there is a will to get back to diplomacy, which I think is sort of lagging now.
Now I'm going to go to you, Assal, and ask you, because in America, one of the reasons perhaps Biden is hesitating is because there is quite a large opposition, and has been ever since the JCPOA came into being, against it. How serious is that in terms of how it will influence what Biden does and how the administration moves forward?
Well, I think the first thing President Biden should do is listen to President Biden, right? When in 2017, this is before Trump actually withdrew from the deal, in anticipation of Trump withdrawing from the deal, Joe Biden had a statement that basically said the idea that the US would withdraw from the deal would not isolate the United States, it would isolate Iran. I mean, sorry, the other way around. It would not isolate Iran, it would isolate the United States. And one of the things he said in his statement is that what the JCPOA, what this deal was accomplishing, is preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And specifically, he said, again, these are the words of now President Biden, that this deal was never meant to be a catch-all, right? So this was the mentality of the Obama administration. This was Biden's own mentality. And that was the criticism of what the Trump administration did, is instead of building on diplomacy, we undermined it, right? The Trump administration completely put diplomacy aside, and we had to start from scratch. In certain ways, this isn't even starting from scratch. And that's why going back to the agreement is so important, right? In building trust, going back to the original agreement is important because really there isn't another way to get another side to agree. And this isn't about, again, this is not about the US and Iran, this is a sort of basic thing that would happen in any situation. As a human being, if you have an agreement with another person and that person undermines the agreement, you would have trust issues. And so it's a natural sort of psychology that leads to the fact that we're not in a trusting position. And so the US, unfortunately for President Biden, he has to fix it. He didn't inherit the 2015 nuclear deal. He inherited Trump's, what he calls himself, manufactured crisis. That's what it is. So based on that crisis, he has to act to actually amend the mistakes that he admitted that Trump made. And in terms of opposition, the issue with opposition is a lot of the opponents of diplomacy are not acting in good faith. And the reason I say that is because are they actually, do they have a problem with the deal, or do they have a problem with diplomacy with Iran? And that's the difference between pragmatism and ideology. What is driving their decision to oppose this? And the reality of it is, every member of this administration has admitted that, not admitted, has proclaimed as a criticism to the Trump administration that this deal was working, that the deal was working for what it was intended to do. And the intention of the deal was to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And we hear this soundbite over and over again from the United States. And we heard it under the Trump administration as well. You know, the sort of view of, we won't allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. Well, Iran agreed to not have a nuclear weapon, didn't they? They agreed to it in the 2015 agreement. So this sort of rhetoric that you hear is more bombast than anything else, because it's not, you know, pragmatically, you had the deal that would prevent it. And this has been said by President Biden, by Secretary of State Antony Blinken, by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. All of them have repeated this point before coming into this new administration. So essentially, they should be, in my view, they should be listening to the voices that elected them, right? One of the reasons why President Biden was elected, and this is one of many, many reasons, by the way, there's a lot of domestic issues in the United States, but in terms of foreign policy, the biggest foreign policy blunder of the Trump administration was withdrawing from this deal and bringing us to the brink of war with Iran, a war that would be incredibly unpopular amongst the American populace, right? There's poll after poll after poll that Americans have war fatigue. You know, the soundbite of ending endless wars is something that Republican and Democratic candidates repeat. And so getting into a conflict would go against the will of the American populace. And so it's not, you know, we can talk about opposition, but in reality, there's a lot more support for this deal than there is opposition. And so that should be the voice that carries.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because the Republicans have been fairly quiet on the JCPOA front. So, but as you say, Americans do not want to get into any more wars in the Middle East. They've made that emphatically clear, and it's a point that Trump was able to play on when he was president. I do see there is a kind of difficulty here for Biden. Again, looking at this situation of the trust deficit, the ideological baggage. Well, let us turn now to what regional U.S. allies could do. I mean, there was a suggestion from you, Dr. GÜNEY, that Qatar could come in and perhaps play a significant role. Oman as well. Oman was very key in the first JCPOA. Let's explore what some of the American U.S. allies could do to try and, you know, unstick this very sticky mess and start this process going forward.
As I said at the beginning, I mean, the GCC countries like Qatar could be, you know, useful in bringing up the two sides together, at least because since Qatar has good relations with the two sides. So it would be really an help, I guess. I'm so sure they are dealing with the issue. But again, we should not overestimate our expectations. The bottom line should be to return to the original agreement, 2015. As I said, the other expectations or critics that are related or associated with the agreement both in US and elsewhere, should be left to the future coming, if there's going to be a table, conferences or whatever. Turkey, in this case, for instance, in 2010, I guess, tried to bring up with Brazil, Iran to swap agreement. And so she had this experience of, having this precedent, I would say, in going to have a 2015 nuclear agreement. That time it was not found enough in terms of compliance and other expectations. But here again, European allies, if we mention NATO countries, EU3, I guess they can also try to, work harder than after 2018 when US withdrawal unilaterally. They tried, but they couldn't be successful, having the agreement on the table. Perhaps they could put more effort in bringing up the trust factor, especially on the side of Iranians, because they also lost faith in Europeans as well. So maybe it is best for the GCC countries, as I mentioned, Oman or Qatar, to be as the mediator, other than European or other Washington's European allies, because of the trust that we needed to bring it here.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thought. However, the Saudis, the Emiratis, they're not so much
into it. I know. Yeah, you're right. But it is the geopolitical situation is very complex, but it is also changing, all the time. So it depends on the conditions available on the ground, I would say. There is a little push from everywhere. There needs to be. I don't know how much it could be credible if the Europeans would be as stood as mediator as they used to be during the 2015 nuclear deal. They, of course, everyone can bring a plate to the table, a food to the table, food of thought. But as far as I can see, GCC is very close to Iran, and among the 6 countries, okay, there are the ones who are not close to Iran, but there are the moderate ones, and also there are close ones. So if you look at 6, at least 4 of the GCC countries seems to be, in favor of bringing up this agreement, because otherwise then we would be facing the dilemma, security dilemma. In the lack of an agreement, we could have a nuclear cascade problem coming up before us, not only Turkey or other regional powers, first of all, before the GCC countries. So they need to put an effort to it.
I wanted to ask you, Hassan Ahmadian, has Europe, is it a bit of a busted flush as far as Iran is concerned, that Europe cannot be trusted, that Europe is not the honest broker it has presented itself as? Is there any more to be had with Iran pushing Europe to perhaps push America to get this thing going?
I think the Europeans' leverage in Tehran is way lower than where it was back during the JCPOA time. It's not after US withdrawal, EU leverage, that E3 specifically leverage in Tehran and its dealings with Tehran went down, and for good reasons. So I don't think they are that much effective, but the Iranians would as the foreign minister tweeted, basically, would want them to play a mediating role. But we don't lack that much, I think, mediators. As GÜNEY said, there are countries that are potentially capable of doing that. So In that sense, Europeans are not that special, but they are closer to the United States. They are more important to the United States, so to speak. So I think the Iranians look at them as such, but still they don't trust them as they did back in the negotiation time of the JCPOA. But when it comes to getting back to the JCPOA, I think there are, beside those mediating parties, potential mediating parties, there are the spoilers that you have mentioned. Those spoilers, I think, would get stronger the longer we lag in getting back to the JCPOA. I think you are giving them a time frame, more time to strengthen their arguments and push back against returning to diplomacy and engagement. So if you look at the GCC now, you could see the split. There are countries that are pushing to get back to the JCPOA. There are countries who are pushing against it, and that is elsewhere in the region. So I think one of the main problems Iran and the region had with the Trump administration was that it wasn't looking at the Middle East from an American lens, mostly from Israeli lens, but also from the Saudi lens. Now the Biden administration, the hope is that it will act more like an American administration, not from the Israeli or the Saudi lens to the region, to Iran. And that would give it more balance, I think, and would give those who believe that the JCPOA is instrumental in further negotiations, regional negotiations, parallel ways for regional security and stability, that would give them, an upper hand in the future. So I think it's not that Europe is not that important, but I think there are parties that have more credit now in Iran and to some extent in the United States that can play that role. So it's not that special about EU to play it.
Let me turn to you, Assal. That idea that there are powerful forces, regional forces that simply do not want to have the JCPOA reinvigorated. A very interesting thought there that the Americans were seeing through the lens of the Saudis and even more particularly through the lens of the Israelis. The Israelis surely are a huge blocker. I've read suggestions from advisors to the IDF that we should get in there and hit Iran hard to prevent negotiations towards a restored JCPOA. How serious a threat do you see that Israeli perspective in terms of moving things forward?
So there's a couple things that I would say on this front. First of all, Israel is not a monolith. Right? Israeli society is not monolithic. The Israeli government is not monolithic. Netanyahu is not representative of all of Israeli society or of all of the Israeli government itself. So we have to be very specific about this. The idea, and none of these states are monoliths, right? When we talk about Iran, when we talk about the US, there's a diversity of views within each of these nations. And the problem with looking at it through the lens of saying, well, is the US, is the US seeing it through an Israeli lens, or is the US seeing it through an unpopular Israeli lens? Which is even more important, right? Because if you think about it, there are Israeli officials, Israeli security and intelligence officials who have said that we should return to the deal, who have talked endlessly for years about how the deal was actually working. And so this isn't about, Israel says this is Netanyahu says this. And Netanyahu is famously for over 2 decades said that Iran is on the brink of having a nuclear weapon. And here we are over 2 decades later, and there is no nuclear weapon. And so at a certain point, you have to consider who are we dealing with who is opposed to this deal. And again, what are the reasons for that, for their opposition? Is Netanyahu opposed on the merits of the deal? If he's actually concerned about a nuclear weapon, then he would endorse the deal, as his own security officials have done. So that's not his real concern. His concern is detente between the US and Iran. He simply doesn't want there to be a cooling of relationships between the United States and Iran. As long as Iran remains the sort of pariah state that the US can constantly talk about, then that allows Israel to do the same and treat Iran in the same way. And so it's not about the deal, and it's not about a nuclear weapon, but they're very good talking points, right? It's a great talking point to say we don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. Neither do we. But what was the way of preventing that? We had a way of preventing it. And for whatever reason, we decided to tear it up and put it into these sort of political talking points. And in terms of, and I'm speaking as an American, right? As an American, it seems very straightforward to say that our policy decisions should be made by the will of the American voters and not by any foreign government in the world. That should not be a controversial statement. That should be a basic statement of someone who believes in a democratic process. The idea of having a deal with Iran, of solving the nuclear issue through diplomacy, has overwhelming support. And we talk about bipartisan support in the US all the time. This has bipartisan support. There was a recent poll in The Economist that 84% of Biden voters, 84% supported negotiations with Iran. 54% of Trump voters supported negotiations with Iran. That was a poll of Americans. So the idea that we would take any alternate path goes against that very will. And so that should really be the question of why is our decision making, why are our policy decisions being made through any lens besides the American lens, right? There would be no question to it in anything else. So that should be the prevailing force. The Americans do not want another conflict. And again, Biden himself, when Trump withdrew from the deal, Biden created this dichotomy and said, now we're on a path either to conflict or having an adversary with a nuclear weapon. These are President Biden's words. So it's not about creating dichotomy as a political talking point. This is the concern that we have. And again, I think the point that should be emphasized is this deal is overwhelmingly supported in the international community. There is international consensus around it. There's no question to that. So at what point do we decide that how we move forward on a deal and an issue that affects the globe is actually decided by the majority of the globe and not by very particular groups?
But let me ask you this, if that is the case, if you have an overwhelming majority of Biden voters and a majority of Trump supporters saying, yeah, we want to negotiate, we want to talk, why then, you know, as you said, on day one, didn't Biden simply say, hey, we're going to go in and we're going to negotiate and we're going to start now? I mean, why has that not happened?
So I think this is where there's a couple of reasons for it. One is I think this is where the ideological reasoning comes in, right? It's very easy to, as an American, it's very easy to point to Iran as an adversary, even when we were negotiating, even under the Obama administration. The language that was used was never one where, you know, we were going to be friends. It was, we're still enemies, but at least we can be enemies that negotiate. And the logic behind that was, President Obama was really emphasized this point, was, well, diplomacy with your allies and your friends is not a complicated task. That shouldn't be difficult. It's, in fact, diplomacy is meaningful when it's with your adversaries, because that's when you need an agreement to make sure that you're on the same page and you're doing things that ensure mutual security. I think part of that sort of the pushback from the Biden administration on just simply getting back to the deal is to play this idea of looking tough on Iran. He doesn't want to look weak. And I, again, in a personal view, I think that is a miscalculation and a misreading of the current situation, which is, you know, even when last year, when there was the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, Americans that were polled thought that that decision made the US less safe, not more safe. And so we're not, unfortunately, and this isn't only in the case of Iran, but in the United States, we're not making decisions necessarily based on what the population is actually asking for. We're making decisions, you have policymakers that are making decisions on an entirely different calculus.
Well, now, Dr. GÜNEY, it's a strange situation, isn't it? Because we all seem to be agreeing that we need to get this sorted. And the polls are saying that, yes, the people wanted it to be sorted. And yet here we are now, well more than a month, almost 2 months into the Biden presidency, and having a conversation about how we can even get these two sides to the table to begin the conversation. It's a bit strange, don't you think?
Yeah, I guess so. But as I said, there are several impediments, as other participants have said. So the ideological barriers are coming into the picture, as well as as far as I observe the situation in US, there are other engagements of Biden administration that has to give an attention to it. For instance, not only with the nuclear deal that the world is waiting and hoping that there would be a kind of a solution. For instance, from the perspective of Turkish foreign policy, we are still waiting that with this new administration, there would be new openings to the Middle East in general, which this deal gets into the picture. But other than that, there are other problems that are waiting on the list that has to be dealt with US itself. I mean, if it's going to be the leading country in this part of the world, there are responsibilities upon the US administration. But as far as I see, they seem to be moving a little slow. This might be due to the domestic as well as other international reasons. For instance, to my mind, according to my viewpoint, it is the Asia pivot, concern, the rise of China, how to deal with it. I guess it is getting ahead of all other issues, this concern of China issue and how the US should be dealing with it. This was also a concern of Obama administration too, but Obama administration was able to bring up a deal at least to, stabilize this region. Nobody expects and wants another hot issue or problem or a conflict in this region. But if US administration could not find a way out to reinvigorate this agreement, then we would be revisiting the old debates like living with a bomb or bombing Iran, the two worst cases that has been talked and written and debated so much so until we reached the 2015 agreement, and the whole world and this region had a breath at least when the agreement was inked. So I guess Washington, the administration needs to be a little bit quick in terms of, prioritizing the issues that is associated with this region's security.
And can I ask you, do you think that President Erdogan could play a role in moving this process forward? Is there, the difficulties that have existed between Turkey and the United States are well known?
That's another issue.
Yeah, that is another issue.
I mean, Turkey is always, it's not related with Erdogan presidency. It is Turkey's stand towards the non-proliferation issue. When you go to the written documents under different administration related to non-proliferation, Turkey has always in favor of supporting non-proliferation. That's why in 2010 she wanted to bring her effort to bring up this swap agreement, for instance, as a president, and it thought that it could be a confidence building, to open up a space to go forward. So I mean, we have a bunch of issues to be waiting to be negotiated with the new administration. So I mean, yes, why not? I mean, if there is a demand from the both sides, Turkey could try to be helpful. But as far as I see, we need to bring up trust building between Washington and Ankara as well. So
let me turn to you, Dr. AHMADIAN. The opponents of the deal, certainly Trump, the Israelis, Netanyahu, in any event, said, look, all that's happening here is that the Iranians have done this deal, but they're just using it as cover. They're moving towards this nuclear capability. How do you address that position?
Well, the deal brought to Iran the most robust inspection mechanism and verification mechanism by the IAEA. And there has been 15 reports by the IAEA about Iran's adherence and abiding by the JCPOA. And the inspection is such that the IAEA can visit each and every place in Iran. Even claims that the Israelis made were brought to Iran by the IAEA, and they inspected places that were claimed, and they, there are different cases, and they didn't find that claim, many of those claims, legit in many ways. So I think it's more sort of a policy talking point rather than a reality, because the inspection mechanism is not about the length of the JCPOA. It's way beyond it. It's there to stay, and it's very robust. It's not, I mean, nuclear material is not something that you can hide in your home. It can leave traces for years, and it's not easy for the Iranians to cheat on it. It's as I said, they don't. I mean, I would second Assal's point that the main problem is that they don't want Iran and the United States to have a detente. That's the main rationale behind it, because they believe that this will strengthen Iran. This will, change the regional equation. They don't want the status quo in the region. They want to change the status quo because they see it to Iran's favor. So a detente with the United States will strengthen Iran, at least consolidate the current situation in the region. And that's, I think, the main rationale. These are talking points. But I think when it comes, I would add another point, which is, I think, related to this. I think we've been here as well when it comes to U.S. policy on Iran. We've been here. I mean, when President Obama came to office, he messaged or sent a letter to the Supreme Leader, and the Supreme Leader was very quick to respond to him, 24 hours. And then we had a presidential election. It was controversial, contested, and then all the things that we know about it, the Green Movement and the developments here. Secretary Hillary Clinton said, wait, the regime is on its knees, and we should wait for now. That lengthened the process for like 4 years. And we didn't have time really to strengthen the agreement. If we did it back in 2009 or 2010, we would have consolidated maybe further, that Trump administration would find it harder to violate. Then now we have Secretary Blinken. I think we should bring this as well to the equation. We have divergence within the new administration as well. I mean, I'm following it very closely, the developments there. I think this policy is similar to that policy. We should wait because the maximum pressure is biting, and the Iranians will come and give more concessions. This is not going to happen. I mean, I've never. I mean, there are rare situations that I've been this confident when predicting future Iranian policies. But this is what it is. Iranians are pissed off with the previous policy, and they cannot really give more. Without the United States going back to what it already signed. So I think this is also very much related to the mentality that is growing in the region, that is hoping that, well, they can spoil the return to the JCPOA. I think the sooner the United States move beyond this mentality that we need to wait for the party on its knee to fall, this will, decrease the effect of these spoilers and lead us to more negotiations and a detente situation, hopefully.
Let me ask you about Saudi Arabia, the fears that the Saudi regime has, and the extent to which they and the Israelis are pretty much on side in how they view Iran.
Well, with regards to Saudi Arabia, ever since the brave new Saudi Arabia came to the scene with bin Salman and King Salman, I think the policy of Saudi Arabia has been really helping the Iranians in the region in many ways. By bashing Iran, by moving against Iran and its allies in the region, they have played into Iran's hands. I mean, they've given Iranians pretty much what they need. I mean, they pushed the Houthis closer to Iran. They pushed the Lebanese closer to Iran. Their policy in Qatar pushed the Qataris closer to Iran. So they are basically doing what they see a catastrophe in the region from their eyes, that the balance is to Iran's favor. They helped Iran in building this power in the region. So I think this policy has repercussions for their influence in the region and for Iran's influence. And their policy has been counterproductive. I think this policy, if it continues, it will be also to Iran's favor, because Iran doesn't need to move a muscle. So I think when it comes to the Saudis, there need to be a revision, really, when it comes to Yemen, when it comes to, the Qatari case, Al-Ula summit was really good in terms of lowering the tension in the region. Hopefully, it will move to that direction. But when it comes to Israel, there is a way more complex situation when it comes to Iran. Iran is building its deterrence against Israel, holding its deterrence against Israel. Nowadays, Israelis are moving to the Persian Gulf with its normalization with Bahrain and the UAE and maybe other countries to follow. So the situation is getting more complex. And I think the insecurity that can stem from this standoff between Iran and Israel can go both ways and can spill over to the region. Hopefully a more balanced US policy in the region, not looking at the region from the lenses of this or that country, would bring more balance to the region. We lack balance in the region, and the United States is a big party to it. The Trump administration has increased the imbalance. Hopefully the Biden administration's choices will lower the imbalance in the region.
Now, Assal, I'm going to ask you to begin really with the tough question, which is, here's where we are. How do we move things forward? So I'll ask you first, and then I want to hear from all of you, really, because this is the big question, isn't it?
In terms of moving forward, we've been at a stalemate because there's this sort of idea of, well, who goes first? And in a sort of idealized situation, the United States would go first. And the reason is simple. The United States is the one that left the deal. Again, I will quote now current President Biden, before he was president. He said last year that Trump quit the deal. Trump walked away, not the Iranians. So when you phrase this, Secretary of State Blinken said that the increased tensions in the region go back to and he called it an original sin of the president tearing up the nuclear deal. So when you have an administration that has admitted all of these things, it is a position of frustration to say, well, then why aren't we just fixing it? We have the power to do so. It's whether or not we have the will. It's not can we or can we not, right? Like this idea of the legality, of course it's legal. The Trump administration left the deal through an executive order and put sanctions with the stroke of a pen. The Biden administration can do the exact same thing to reverse those steps. But what's interesting is the Biden administration hasn't even returned to the deal. And that's a separate issue than sanctions, right? But when you're looking at the deal right now, the US is still not a party to it. The US is outside of the deal. So it's having this conversation continuously outside of the deal and in violation of all its commitments as well. So it's fascinating to go back and forth and say, well, Iran isn't in compliance. Well, neither is the United States. But Iran, on a practical side, Iran has signaled the idea of a synchronized compliance, right? Like, let's come back to the deal, even if it's in smaller pieces, if it's all the way in, but let's do it simultaneously. And I think that's a very important proposal and something that the Biden administration should consider more carefully rather than continuing this sort of posturing stance of, well, Iran has to do this first before we do anything. One thing that's fascinating is Biden in April of last year, April of 2020, so sort of the beginning wave of the pandemic, wrote a statement specifically about COVID relief for Iran during a pandemic. In that piece, Biden said that while there are humanitarian exemptions to sanctions, he admitted that in practice, US sanctions are impeding humanitarian goods to Iran. And he actually called on Trump to take immediate steps, those were his words, immediate steps to address that very issue. And yet here we are 2 months into his administration, he's done no such thing, right? And so these are really important steps that can be taken and should be taken, and were the things that Biden himself said. It doesn't mean that everything has to go back at once. Iran has not signaled that that has to be the case, but some good faith measure on the US, I think, is required to be able to go back to the deal, to create that trust again. And really just to see that this administration is abiding by its own promises, right? This administration didn't say, we're going to go in and see if we return to the deal. Biden was asked point blank as a candidate, who was going to return to the deal, and raised his hand on stage and said he would return. So I think a lot of his supporters are feeling certain frustration that that's not happening and that we continue to be outside of the deal. And something else to keep in mind is we continuously talk about like a good faith effort. Well, the Rouhani administration did take a good faith effort in the IAEA compromise. With the IAEA compromise on the additional protocol, Rouhani took a lot of domestic heat because there was a parliamentary bill in Iran that said that they would no longer abide by that. But Rouhani came to an agreement because Rafael Grossi, the director of the IAEA, flew to Tehran in a sense of urgency to make sure that there can be some compromise to save this deal, to save that diplomacy. The Biden administration and President Biden himself has yet to take that kind of pressure. And the reality of it is that some domestic pressure has to be taken. But again, who is putting that pressure on? People who are opposed to the deal, people who were opposed to diplomacy. So, and I said this earlier, but it really brings us to a point where who should this administration be listening to? Their supporters or their detractors? So hopefully there's some kind of good faith step taken by the United States in order to really get Iran to return to compliance and get the United States to return to compliance in a synchronized fashion. And that way it avoids the stalemate of going back and forth of who should go first.
Yeah, synchronicity. That's an interesting thought, and it seems quite a long way away. I'm just wondering, Dr. Hassan AHMADIAN, does Iran need to do something? Is there a gesture that Iran should be making? Should perhaps Iran withdraw from some of its theaters of action, such as its support for the Houthis? Is that something that would signal to President Biden that there is an effort at play here that, we want to work with you?
I think bringing other issues to the JCPOA would only complicate things. The JCPOA and the return to it is already too complicated an issue, too complicated with other stuff. So I think it's really not a good policy or good way to go forward. So the Iranians can signal, but I think there is way less appetite for this because of what we discussed already. I mean, there has been an agreement, it was violated, so they are saying, well, what guarantees that if we do this, then the thing that we want also will happen? So it's really boils down to the trust issue and the policy that the Trump administration went for. So I think this is really an important thing to keep in mind. But also, as with the agreement with Grossi and previously, I mean, before the Biden administration was inaugurated, there was a heated debate here in Tehran about the compensation for the violation of the agreement that the United States needs to pay. It's not, it has violated, it has imposed harm to the Iranian nation, to the Iranian economy. It has to pay compensation, and it was a really heated debate. But I think that moving forward with the Biden administration sworn in, the Iranians came to a conclusion that we will, pursue that legally, but let's not complicate things when it comes to return to the JCPOA. Let the thing go ahead with the Biden administration's new policy. So they thought that they are compromising something already. Now with the Grossi also, they showed that they prefer diplomacy. But when it comes to leverage building and the leverage that the United States is seeing in the maximum pressure still to this day, I can only envisage the Iranians moving ahead with their policy of leverage building. And this leverage building and using leverage on both parties can only complicate things. So I think that when you hear folks in Washington that we need to, there's the leverage, we need to use it, and the Iranians will have to come to some sort of compromise. We need to remind them that there is also other party that is not static. It is also moving. It is also calculating, and it is also building its own leverage. So I think this can complicate things further, but I think it also helps maybe in months to come to get to the conclusion that this is not the right way. We need to change course. We need to get to the agreement that we already had. Provided that there's a will, we can go forward. If not, at least we have this. We have a detente, and the United States can focus on its own list of priorities. It has its plate filled with internal and global issues. Iran is not really that top strategic priority. It is important, but it's not that top priority. And the Iranians have also other priorities to deal with. So I think this rationality should come to both to Washington and to Tehran to move things ahead. And I think we are not that far from that outcome.
Dr. GÜNEY, let me ask you, because there is a perception that the Iranians are also using the JCPOA. Dr. GÜNEY, are you there? Oh, we seem to have lost Dr. GÜNEY. Don't know. Well, then I'll put it to you, Assal. There is a perception that the JCPOA was a cover too for Iran to export its revolution in Syria, in Yemen, support for Hezbollah. Would it help at all if the Iranians pulled back? It's a similar sort of question that I put to Hassan, but I'm curious as to how you might respond to that.
I think Dr. GÜNEY is coming back, by the way.
You're back. Okay.
If you want to go back to your original question.
Dr. GÜNEY, are you back?
Yeah, I guess so.
All right, yeah. Good. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Well, the question was, and I'll put it to you because I thought I'd lost you, is that there are those who say that the JCPOA gave some sort of cover, and that the Iranians are, pretending to want to negotiate. Meanwhile, they're expanding their territorial aggrandizement in Syria, Yemen, their support for Hezbollah. If they pulled back a little bit, would that help to build some sort of give Joe Biden some political capital? Is that a sensible approach, do you think?
Well, I guess JCPOA is a separate issue. I mean, it's dealing with non-proliferation issue. Actually, that is how it has been constructed from the very beginning. Yes, the idea of Obama administration to re-engage with Iran via the help of this agreement. Sanctions were going to lift it, and Iran was going to re-engage with the rest of the world. That was the expectation. But on the contrary, we have seen that due to many reasons. I mean, our aftermath of Arab Spring, the power vacuums, the failed and failing states, all sorts of volatile situation of the Middle East, has brought some opportunities for Iran to expand its zone of influence where its Shia groups that are, located in different parts of the region. But this has not started with JCPOA. This was the starting year was 2003, and it was the U.S. Unilateral intervention to Iraq. That is how the story has unfolded on the benefit of Iran to move in and to bring about whoever says this Shia crescent from Bahrain to Lebanon, you may draw it. So it is not started with the JCPOA, and what critics of the agreement were saying that it didn't include ballistic missiles that is proliferating of Iran, or it has it has accelerated the Iranian influence in the region. Maybe yes, but I mean, the Iranian strategy using this asymmetric war in different parts of the Mediterranean, MENA region has go back to 2003. So I mean, the mistakes, if there is on behalf of the US, has been made beforehand. The expectations were different then, and they didn't match with what's on the ground. I mean, after Iraq was liberated, that is how it was set by Washington in 3 days. They were thinking that Iraq would be an example for the whole Middle East, and we have seen that since then. We are observing the fluctuated, scene of the Middle East, and more problems unfolded one another. So I mean, it's good. I mean, if they can manage it, to bring Iranians to make gestures in terms of retreating from certain regions. I don't believe in that. I mean, they would expect in return a concession from the US or the others. So I mean, the realistic way of dealing this issue, just to go back to what we have at 2015, the nuclear agreement, and then re-engage it with Iran, trying to, persuade them within a passage of time, not in 1 day or 2 days, or just after a day of, revisiting the agreement. You need to build this lacking deficit in trust, and, with give and take, both sides, you can come up to a point.
Well, let me, we've just got a few more minutes, and I think that there's a sense developing of some optimism that this can be worked through, sorted out. I'm just wondering, Assal, is the time moving by? Tempus fugit. Time is, and the opportunity to capitalize is slipping away. Is that the threat that perhaps the Biden administration is not grasping? The time is running out. And Hassan mentioned the election in June is coming up in Iran, and so I think, perhaps as we're rounding off this conversation, we should try and pitch forward and look at how much time we've got, and whether we dare have some optimism.
Well, let me say this. The United States is the most powerful country in the world. And sometimes when you are the most powerful, you have a blind spot. And the blind spot is you see things only through your own lens, and you assume nobody else has agency to act. And that's sort of the way that the Biden administration is approaching Iran, by dismissing the fact that there's going to be an election in June, as if whoever is in power will make absolutely no difference. Of course it would, because the difference between when Ahmadinejad was in power and when Rouhani was in power is quite clear. There's a reason why they didn't go through negotiations at that time, and it was much more challenging. And now, under the Rouhani administration, you had that opportunity. If the election in Iran goes a particular way, and we don't know what direction it's going to go in, that can change the atmosphere. If even rhetorically, right? If even in the sense of the language and the sort of, as we've talked about ideology so much, even if the language is the only thing that changes the atmosphere, that changes the way that people think about things. So it's likely going to be consequential, and ignoring that, I think, is a miscalculation on the part of the United States, because they sort of have this window of opportunity, in all honesty, easily return to the deal. They have that opportunity right now. And whether or not they choose to pass it up is a decision that's going to be made by the Biden administration. In terms of being hopeful, John Azvinian just came out with a new book on the history of US-Iran relations called America and Iran. And he looks at 300 years of history. And, earlier in this conversation, I brought up the two sort of infamous dates, 1953 and 1979. And what this book does is it goes way beyond that. It says, look, these aren't the only historical points that these two nations have had relations. And if we understand that, we know that this is not really a sort of clash of civilizations that people try to make it out to be. Because in fact, there is a rich history of mutual admiration. And there is a way of, if not being allies, if not being friends, there is a way for adversaries to simply come to an agreement. And we know that because we've already done it. We've already done it. We already know it's possible. And that's why that should be the foundation that we build on. You know, this isn't to say that there are no legitimate grievances against Iran and what the Iranian government does in the region, but it is to their own benefit to have regional stability and security. And so the only way to accomplish that is to have a foundation to build on. And this is the foundation to build on. And if we choose to let that opportunity pass, you know, I mean, as a historian, I don't like to predict things, but it'll be interesting to look back at this historical moment and see what could have been if we sort of allowed ourselves to not give into this posturing, you know, not give into the fact that we have to look tough and actually make decisions that are what's best for people. And I think my last comment on this is to be, I think that's what's so often missing in these conversations, the suffering of actual people. Right? In Iran right now, millions of people are suffering under sanctions. In a pandemic, they continue to suffer under sanctions. That is a very serious issue that, you know, in these sound bites and political talking points so often get overlooked. And on the American side, again, there's a reason why Americans have war fatigue. They don't want conflict anymore. Their resources are being spent on fruitless adventures in the Middle East, while Americans are also suffering at home. And so what you hope that these states do, which ideally they should do, and since we're talking about idealism, is prioritize their people over this sort of posturing that goes back and forth. And there is certainly that opportunity to do so. And I stay optimistic that we will return to the deal.
Hassan, let me ask you, does it matter who's elected in June? If the hardline slate wins, does that mean that JCPOA is dead? We just turn off the life support?
Well, I think it will for sure have an effect on the way forward with regards to the JCPOA, but I wouldn't go as much to say that it will be dead, because as I said, I mean, it can complicate things. It can lengthen the process. It can bring other issues to the table on the part of Iran, and there are, you know, potential candidates bringing these issues to the debate, to public debates related to the future election. So I can say that it will be way more complicated. I can foresee that. But to say that it will be dead, I think it will be an exaggeration, because at the end of the day, the strategic community and, I mean, the main stakeholders in the Iranian establishment, as I said, it's a consensus-built, consensus-driven mechanism that comes up with the main macro strategic policies, and many of these figures will be changed with the new administration, but many of them also will remain in place. So you have both. So they can complicate, the newcomers can complicate things, but to alter the entire equation, I think it's not going to be the case. So I think that's the issue. Now, going back to another point, I think, you know, in an ideal situation, I would hope that the Biden administration, I mean, President Biden himself, come to the fore and say, we will get back to the JCPOA because we violated it, and this is not who we are, as he always recurred to saying. But there is no idealism in real politics. I mean, President Biden coming to the office, he didn't change the Iran policy to this day, and people are suffering. Iranians have fought the pandemic with one hand tied to their back, and they are still doing that. This is really a humanitarian issue that I think also can be part of the debate that I see really lacking in the strategic debate in Washington specifically. So hopefully this will change, but until we get to that point, I think the leverage building and mutual leverage building will be the main thing, because power is what is this, directing things between Iran and the United States for now.
And well, I think Dr. GÜNEY, you will have the final word. I just briefly wanted to reflect on the thought that the JCPOA, the Security Council, plus Germany, plus the EU, plus Iran, what was missing in that? Well, the Middle East was missing. I'm wondering, if the Middle East is the bridge that can move things forward.
Well, this has been put forward previously. I mean, there should be countries from the Middle East with the P5+1, but it has not been accepted as far as I know. And so to be realistic, I guess, and there is not one viewpoint coming up from the Middle East. If we go sub-regionally from the GCC, we don't see, uniform one idea, how to bring up, reinvigorate the nuclear deal. So I don't think that there would be that kind of a new opening. So maybe we should stick to our, thinking that how the deal between the two sides, namely Washington as well as Iran, can be reinvigorated. But as far as I see, the time is ticking, and there's not much left to the June. Of course, as Hassan has said it, I mean, it took so many years to reach to 2015 agreements. So, I mean, even if there's a change after June, elections in the Iran, even if hardliners would have a more say, I mean, the negotiations will last and continue, but the situation will be more complex, of course. The dialogue mechanism will not be easy as it can be right now. There's an opportunity window, a little, open. I hope Washington will grasp this, moment. But as far as I see, Biden administration in regard to, issues of the Middle East are quite slow coming up. Hope they will, accelerate that pace of dealing with the issues, including JCPOA and others.
We have now come to the end of our time, and I thank you all very much. I mean, it's I'm pleased that we're ending on a more positive note, because I've been in several panels discussing the JCPOA in Iran. They've all ended feeling very, very morose. I feel that we've at least moved the needle a little further into the positive zone, acknowledging that there are very many serious difficulties, and acknowledging too that America as the world superpower perhaps needs to be the one that takes that first important step, and that time is really of the essence. So again, I thank you all, Dr. Nurşin GÜNEY in Istanbul, Dr. Assal in Orange County, I think I've got that right, yeah? And Dr. Hassan AHMADIAN in Tehran, and of course my thanks to Gulf State Analytics and to now there you go, excuse me, to DİPAM, and my thanks to DİPAM. Okay, thank you all so very much. It was terrific to have this conversation.
We thank to you.
Thank you.
Okay, there we go.